Thank you very much for joining us to hear today about a recipe for award-winning online community engagement, featuring our special guests from Anchorage, Alaska. We've got a really interesting program for you today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with a little overview of some best practices that we have found as we looked across multiple case studies for online engagement, and that's going to set it up nicely to look specifically at what Anchorage did with online engagement to complement their planning process. So let's begin. So the context is sort of this. We've been working like this for years and years, and I can only imagine that the person taking this picture was trying to figure out what angle do I take it from to make it seem like we had a decent turnout. And we have a special name for these people. We call these people the STP. That is the same 10 people that show up to everything. And it seems like oftentimes this is the case, or this happens. We've got a fantastic turnout, but everybody's fired up and angry about something. And that's what's motivating them to show up. Within this context, because we have a lot of experience with online engagement, the American Planning Association and several other departments asked us to review case studies to answer a few key questions. The first question is, how specifically can online tools help to improve this situation? And secondly, what do the most successful projects have in common? So the first thing that we asked is, what does successful mean? So we looked across multiple case studies, and we now have looked at over 225 case studies, and we saw some patterns in what was coming back to us. They first talked to us about the quantity of engagement. Not only do they want to engage more people, but they want to make sure that they're engaging a broader demographic than traditionally has been involved in these sort of things. And secondly, the quality of engagement needs to be improved. Not only just getting people's ideas, but collecting informed input. So people are educated about the choices, and that we can trust that the information coming back is meaningful in terms of people being aware of trade-offs associated with different choices and so forth, but also actionable. It's not enough to just collect a whole bunch of people's ideas. We need to make conclusions about what, for example, 3 out of 4 people said this, or 25% of people felt this, or people over this age felt differently, and so forth. We need to be able to summarize it so the results coming back are actionable. So those were the sort of the marching orders that we got when we looked across case studies, and that's how we evaluated case studies going forward. Out of this research, 7 key lessons just jumped out at us, and so I want to share those briefly with you today. I don't want you to feel the need to take notes during this session. Just sit back and enjoy. We're going to be sending around a guidebook that you can use later that's got all the information that we're going to be sharing, and some other ideas in it laid out attractively. So stand by for that in the follow-up material. The first one is designed for the unmotivated. Now, this is an interesting one. There are always going to be people who are positive and negative about whatever is going on in the community. Most people, however, are in the moderate middle. It turns out that this really affects people's level of motivation. The most motivated people are the people who are motivated by either anger or fear about what's going on. Those are the types of people that will typically come out to anything that you plan and essentially give you a piece of their mind. The people who are least motivated are actually not the people who are right in the middle, but the people who are moderately positive about what's going on in the community. They just aren't worried about what's going on in the community enough to come out and participate in something unless it's super easy. And so if you design your engagement for people who are unmotivated, you will get the broadest cross-section of ideas and viewpoints possible. You'll also get some people, that are much more supportive than you would get if you had a very high barrier to participation. It's sort of like coaxing a squirrel to eat out of your hand. You don't want to do anything to scare them off. Number 2, and this kind of feeds into it, aim for about a 5-minute experience. We have found when we looked across case studies that asking people for more than 5 minutes, we see a huge drop-off in participation. Asking people for less than 5 minutes, you don't actually get that much benefit. So 5 minutes tends to be about the sweet spot. Number 3, registration beforehand is a real killer of enthusiasm, particularly for the unmotivated. In fact, only about 1 in 10 people will fill out a registration in order to participate in something online. 9 out of 10 of those people will just say, you know what, I'm just not that interested. So if you can choose a software or an online approach that does not require people to register before they participate, you'll get a much bigger audience as a result of that. Number 4, offer as many different ways to engage as possible. Now, web-based engagement and smartphone engagement are absolutely critical. In fact, over 50% of users of MetroQuest right now, participants, are using smartphones. So not only does your online engagement need to work on a smartphone, it should be delightful on a smartphone, because most people will actually be using a smartphone to access it. Now, we have had a great deal of success using kiosks. Putting a kiosk in a community center or a recreation center in the right location, a kiosk can get 200 to 500 people a day. And you can imagine targeting specific populations that are in maybe underrepresented areas and getting their opinions and moving the kiosk to different places. And then, of course, there's ideas like having tablets available for people at a community event that's being held by another group, setting up a table and engaging people that way. So there's a variety of ways of leveraging technology to make events and locations a little bit more productive for getting a broad variety of people's input. Number 5, make it as insightful and delightful as possible. Now, these words are chosen specifically. Insightful means kind of creating an educational experience. It's kind of getting at that collecting informed input requirement that we heard from so many agencies. So creating a bit of an educational experience for people and hopefully making that experience as enjoyable and visual as possible. The results, the difference between kind of a multiple choice survey and something that's visual and interactive, about 7.5 times more participation just by doing that, making that change. Now, because of the nature of the session today, I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but I do want to show you some examples about how we took this research to heart within MetroQuest to try to make the experience fast and as insightful and delightful as possible. So let me show you a few examples quickly. I'll start with the example from our special guest today, Anchorage Talks Transit. They use MetroQuest in a really interesting way to engage people on transit questions. And so the welcome screen just kind of welcomes people, shows people a few ideas about what's going on in the project, and invites them to begin. The first question that they asked is probably the best question to start any conversation with the public. What's important to you? It's really, really an inviting question, and it sets a kind of a tone for people that it is really about what's important to them. And as they do this, they create a rank order of their most important aspects of improving the transit system. The next step here uses our scenario screen, and this is a very interesting way of kind of presenting people some information about different alternatives and then get their input very quickly. So here we've got a number of different options for people, and as you look down here, you can see these are my top priorities, and very, very quickly I can see what trade-offs are associated with these different alternatives. I can read a little bit about them, I can look at a visualization, and I can see which ones perform best on my top priorities. And then you can weigh in on which one you prefer before you move on. So packing a little bit of education and some fun kind of things to look at in the engagement process is really important. This last step invites people to allocate a budget. So here we are putting coins into different categories. And again, it's a kind of a fun exercise that people can do, but it also lets people know, hey, we've got some constraints here. We can't just allocate all this budget to everything. Here, what we're trying to communicate is, here's a fun exercise to look at different priorities, but really, realistically, we have some limitations on the funds available. And then this last step, and remember when I said don't ask them to sign up first and ask them for their email and log on and that sort of thing. If you put that step at the end, people will actually do it, because at this point, people are engaged. People are interested. They know what the scope of the project is. They know what's at stake, and they have a reason to put this information in, and they're curious about getting the results of this survey, and so they want to put their email in there so they can be notified when the results are available. They are engaged at this point. It's only 5 minutes after you might have asked them to sign up, but you're asking them at the right time when they are motivated to do so. Now, this survey was also offered in Spanish and Hmong and Tagalog languages to allow people to go to the survey that best met their needs. I'm going to show you just a few more examples here, not to be comprehensive, but just to reinforce this point that I was making about trying to make it as insightful and delightful as possible to connect with people. And particularly, that gets you a lot of benefits, not just in engaging people, but people are much more likely to share it when they've enjoyed the experience. This project here, we always get a good chuckle out of this one. This was a highway rehabilitation project. They started with that most important question: what's most important to you? You'll notice this one here, moose safety, and that's going to be the theme for the next minute or so, because they're asking, moose are a critical issue in Alaska, and then they're asking people about a little visual preference survey here. What kind of measures do you like or dislike about safety improvements, and of course the all-important moose mitigation strategies to improve safety. And then the last step here invites people to put on the map any of their transportation habits, how they use the area, and any ideas that they have so they can kind of tell you what they're most interested in. And of course, they can designate an area as a high moose activity area. So there's the moose coming back into it again. So another good one that really used some interactivity to keep it interesting for people and collect some valuable data. This next project in Bend, Oregon was quite interesting. They used 2 phases in this project. So this was the first phase where they were getting some pretty high-level information on people's goals for the urban growth boundary. They also engaged people on different strategies. So here's different strategies to help them dive in a little bit further. And then getting their opinions on land use suggestions, transportation improvements, and natural areas. And then in the next phase, when they went out again for engagement, they did some interesting things with scenarios. So having people look at different growth boundary scenarios and seeing the pros and cons of them before moving forward. And then this last one, I really like this one because it provides a kind of a game-like experience, but really educates people about, in this case, Vancouver, Washington street funding issues. So here we're being asked, how much do you want to essentially invest in the street funding program? So here I've selected programs that add up to about $8 million a year. And here in this step, I've got to figure out how I'm going to fund that. which is an interesting thing, an interesting position to put the community in, where they've got to figure out how they're going to balance their budget. So there, I've balanced the budget using these mechanisms. So I'm just showing you these to let you know that it's really important to kind of combine education with an interactive experience if you want to get people excited about what you're doing, but also get lots of valuable input. So that's how we've kind of taken the lessons to heart here at MetroQuest. A few other points before I turn it over to our co-presenters. Promotion is absolutely critical. So a couple lessons from Don Draper. You've got about 5 seconds to get somebody's attention with a campaign, whatever it is. Then if you get their attention, then they might give you about 5 minutes of their time. And if you treat them well during that 5 minutes, then they might tell 50 friends. And that's how you go from a small public engagement to a large public engagement. When people are telling each other about it, then it really does take off quite quickly. Here's one of my favorite campaigns of late, a project that we worked on in Nashville. It was about a visioning process for Nashville, and so they created this campaign, All Right Nashville, It's Time to Pick. And they had these different cards that were going around, and this next one is the one that just made it shoot through the roof. All right, Nashville, it's time to pick. This little girl was all of a sudden everywhere on Facebook and Twitter, and the participation just went through the roof. And of course, then you have to treat people well during their 5-minute experience, and then it goes viral from there. And the last thing I'll mention about strategies that we learned is the importance of monitoring the participation and adjusting as needed. So these online engagement tools will give you some demographics about who's participating and who's not participating. And it's important to leave some creative budget for your kind of boots on the ground effort to be able to fill in some of the gaps of maybe underrepresented populations, and using some targeted strategies, which I'll talk about in just a sec. So there, again, are the 7 key success factors that we teased out of those 225 case studies that we examined. Once again, all contained in the guidebook, which I will share with you tomorrow. I want to, before I turn it over to our guests from Anchorage, I want to just highlight some interesting things that we saw in a recent project in Atlanta. So they engaged people online, and they did some really interesting things to kind of promote the engagement. They contacted their media. It turns out that the media is sitting around waiting for stories like this that are relevant to the community. As soon as they got a spot on the 6 o'clock and the 11 o'clock news, participation just went through the roof. And they did it in kind of an interesting way. They created a share kit, which is essentially a 2 or 3 page Word document that they shared with bloggers, community group leaders, and stakeholders that they were connected with already. And what it contained was sample Facebook posts, sample tweets, and sample blog posts of different lengths with graphics that people could easily say, hey, I want to write a blog post about this. I'll take a few graphics, I'll take this paragraph, I'll edit a bit, and I'll get it out really quickly. All of a sudden, 100 different groups were calling out to the community, to their own trusted community, to participate in this project. And that's really made a huge difference in getting the media's attention and also getting the attention of a lot of different members of groups around the community. They also did a really great job of monitoring by postal codes, it turns out, within MetroQuest, who was being represented and who was being underrepresented, and they took their show on the road. So they, instead of holding a whole bunch of costly workshops and getting the usual suspects, they saved some of their budget for these pop-up workshops that they essentially went to a community meeting that was being held by another group, and they asked if they could have a table. They had a table and some signs, and they engaged people that were maybe underrepresented online. There's a variety of different strategies you can use for sort of what I call pop-up engagement, like these boards that were created by Neighborland that I really like. Just share your ideas on a board, or put the dots next to the images that are most interesting to you for a design project or a planning project. Very, very quick to do and fun for people, creates a little bit of a buzz. You can put these anywhere. The last point that I'll make is the importance of knowing that the engagement process doesn't end when you stop needing the community's input. It ends when you tell the community what you heard and you let them know that their input affected the outcome. That kind of reinforcement creates a culture of engagement that reinforces the value of engagement, and you will see your engagement grow each time you go out for a planning process if you tell people what you heard and you reinforce that they're having an impact with their public participation. In this process, they engaged over 25,000 people, which was fantastic. And I think a lot of it was, the combination of how they used online engagement, but also some strategies for engaging the communities. With that, I am going to turn it over to our special guests from Anchorage, Alaska. We're gonna hear from Michelle Poyero and Colin Hodges now. Michelle it works at Garrett Walker and Associates, and Colin is with the municipality. He's a transit planner there, and they are going to speak to you about a very interesting case study. So let me just pass the presenter role over to them.
All right. Thank you, Dave. My name is Michelle Poyero, and as Dave said, I'm a senior associate with Garrett Walker and Associates, and we are a transit network design firm. We do many different kinds of transit planning, but what we really specialize is designing transit networks. And the municipality of Anchorage hired us last year to help them come up with a new vision for their transit network, and in particular to engage the public and key stakeholders in that conversation. So we ended up focusing on two trade-offs that arise in transit planning and that particularly arise in Anchorage. And I want to tell you how we asked people their opinions about those trade-offs. And so the way I'm going to do that is actually just to help you understand the trade-offs first. So you'll learn a little bit about transit planning as a side effect of learning about public involvement in this webinar. So the first trade-off has to do with how you allocate resources across geographic space. I'm showing you a little drawing here of a fictional urban area. The dots in the drawing are residents and jobs, and then the little gray lines are roads. And you can see that most of the residents and jobs are concentrated around two main roads, and then smaller numbers of people live and work on smaller, curvier roads. And then as the fictional transit agency for this fictional urban area, we have 18 buses. That's our budget. That's our fiscal constraint. So how should we allocate those buses? Where should we put them? How should we design a network? That depends entirely on our goals. If our goal is getting really high transit ridership, then we would do this. We would maximize ridership by thinking like a business. We would choose which markets we enter. And we would focus frequent service where there are the most residents and jobs. Those are the markets we would choose to focus on. Now, all 18 of our buses we have put on just two routes on those two main roads that have the most residents and jobs. You can count the buses. There are 18 of them. Because we have so many buses on just two routes, the buses come really frequently. People don't have to wait. And because there are lots of people who don't have to wait to ride a bus to some place where there are lots of other people, we get high ridership. The other way we describe this kind of performance is productivity, not just high ridership, but high ridership relative to cost. Now, the problem with this is that you can see there are many dots, residents and jobs on this map that don't have any bus service near them at all. So what about them? What if there's some old lady in the corner who's now stranded, can't get to her doctor's appointment? Well, that really speaks to a different goal for transit that is not about maximizing ridership, and that is a goal of coverage. So if you design a transit network to maximize coverage, you think about getting some service close to everyone. This is more like a traditional government service. You try to serve everyone, even people in expensive to serve places. And what you get is more routes covering everybody, but each route has much lower frequency, and therefore each route has lower ridership. But by one measure, this network is doing wonderfully, and that is a measure of access. 100% of the people in this urban area have access to some transit service, even if they probably aren't going to ride it. So this is not a binary choice for most agencies. It's a spectrum. You know, they can be more towards maximizing ridership, or they can be more towards providing coverage in low ridership places. But a move on the spectrum in one direction is a move away from the other goal. So agencies, they choose a place on the spectrum, and sometimes they do it explicitly, and sometimes they do it implicitly. We decided to put this in front of the public in Anchorage, this kind of trade-off, this very trade-off. And so we started out at a big kickoff event at the Art Museum. We got some of the not usual transit suspects to come out because it was a little unusual to have an event at the Art Museum. We had a lecture that covered a lot of different topics about transit, but also explained this trade-off. And then we showed people a very similar diagram to the one I just showed you, and explained it and asked them to express their opinion about how the trade-off should be made in Anchorage. So the little orange dots you see on the blue arrows at the bottoms of these boards are the dots people were given to vote when they walked in the door, and they were encouraged to go and put their vote on each of these boards. And it basically tell us, here's where I think Anchorage ought to be on the spectrum based on my own values. And here's a close-up of the board just about this ridership coverage trade-off. So you'll recognize the little diagrams from the explanation I gave you. And as you can see, there are more orange dots towards the high ridership side of the spectrum, though not all the way. Colin, who will speak to you in just a little bit, who works for the municipality, he also took this board around to many different public meetings after the kickoff event. So this was a tool that we were able to use in many different settings. And one of the things we like about it so much is that not only can people express their opinion in a way it's not a yes or no, it's not a binary choice. They can really think about what they value and reflect that with their vote, but they also get to see how all of their neighbors, all of their fellow community members voted. So they learn something about their community while also expressing their own opinion. We also brought up this trade-off at a stakeholder workshop. We had a group of almost 40 stakeholders get together. We taught them some transit planning by playing a game that was nonetheless very educational. And then we did real-time polling in which we asked them about a couple of trade-offs, including this one. And here's their response to this trade-off question. And of course, there's much more explanation to them than I'm showing you now, but this is their answer. You know, Anchorage today spends about 50% of its budget trying to maximize ridership and 50% providing coverage, regardless of ridership. What do you think they should do in the future? And their responses were really concentrated on the side of, let's move to higher ridership and therefore reduce geographic coverage. We also brought this up in a web survey, and Dave already gave you an excellent tour of the web survey, so I won't do it again, but you can see here that we set up certain priorities, and understanding how these two very different networks would deliver on those priorities, we were able to show people, in this example, if what you care about is a simpler network, well, a high ridership system is going to give you a simpler network. But if what you care about is fewer transfers, then a high ridership system is actually not going to give you fewer transfers. So we were able to show people very honestly, here's what the trade-off would mean for you based on what you say you care about. And here's the results from the web survey. The data that MetroQuest gave us allowed us to see how highly people tended to rank the high ridership scenario as opposed to the high coverage scenario. We were able to see that the high ridership scenario was considerably more popular. So here's another trade-off that comes up, and it's a big one for Anchorage. Again, imagine we have 18 buses, and we want to design a little transit network for these 6 parts of our community. we can do the sort of obvious thing and run routes from every place to every other place. We'll have 9 routes, but each of them just has 2 buses running on it, which means that service isn't coming very often. So if I want to go from Spenard to the university, I have to wait a long time, either wait at my departure or wait at my arrival, because the bus actually just doesn't arrive at the right time for my class, so I have to be very early or very late. So I don't have to transfer, and I have a direct route, but I have a lot of wait, and sometimes that means if I've missed my bus, I really have a long wait for the next one. This is not the only way to design a transit network. There's another way in which you, instead of having direct routes, you have people connect. You ask people to transfer at some central connection point, and because you've done that, you can assign your 18 buses to shorter routes, and those routes can be much more frequent. So now if I want to go from Spenard to the university, I wait a short amount of time for a more frequent route, then I get off at the connection point, and again I wait a short amount of time for a more frequent route to the university. And even though I'm transferring, and this may be hard to believe, but I've done the math in real cities and for these diagrams, even though you're transferring, it's actually faster because the frequencies are so much better. So this is a really important trade-off. You know, people don't like to transfer, but people like to get where they're going soon, and they don't like to have a long wait if they miss their bus. So what do they prefer? So this is another question that we asked using images, and we asked it in all these same fora that I already described. We asked it at the kickoff event using a similar type of board. You can see with all the orange dots, there's definitely a strong preference for asking people to make connections in exchange for faster trips and better reliability. Colin also took this board around to public meetings after our kickoff event. We asked it in the web survey. We had these 2 fictional scenarios, and then we showed people how their priorities would be served or not served by one of these scenarios or the other. And this is the results we got from the web survey, very strong preference, similar to what you see on that board from the public meetings, for the connected network that asks people to transfer rather than the complex network with the lower frequencies. So I'm going to pass it to Colin, who is going to give you a little summary of the engagement, because he was so much closer to the ground than I was, and he had to do a lot of the things that Dave described as really good practices for public engagement once you're on the ground and meeting with people and understanding all your limitations and all the real complications out there in the world.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So as Michelle mentioned, we did quite a lot of work outside of kind of on the ground in the community, and both Jarrett Walker and Associates and MetroQuest were great partners in this effort, but even with their help, there was a lot of work to do. So throughout the spring and summer of 2016, we gave presentations about the project and solicited feedback at 17 different community council meetings, which took a lot of staff time and actually happened all within about a month. We initiated contact, followed up, and just coordinated in general with a large group of stakeholders, on paper about 80 plus stakeholders, of which 38 ended up coming to the stakeholder workshop and are still engaged with us pretty heavily. We updated and kept a project website up to date that just kept everybody up to date about outreach events that we were planning. Documents were uploaded, and also had links to the actual MetroQuest survey itself. We staffed informational tables, sort of like the pop-up events that Dave mentioned earlier, in the field and at different community events. So, for example, at 2 of our major transit centers, and also at a few different community fairs, kind of street fair situations. In general, received a high volume of public contacts and comments, and that required a lot of sorting and response, and just keeping tabs on what people wanted, making sure that we could quantify all of that input. Did a lot of translating, and also had interpreters at our major event. So for the 4 major languages outside of English in Anchorage are Hmong, Tagalog, Spanish, Korean. Then we also added American Sign Language to the mix. And Doing all of that also came at a bit of a cost. We spent, I think, over $2,000 on translating materials and interpreting content at events. Then we also had a big digital and print advertising push. Again, that came with a price tag, but ended up being pretty effective, as you'll see. We also made sure that we kept people up to date on social media, so primarily Facebook and Twitter. And crucially, we had to sponsor a lot of those Facebook posts. Otherwise, there weren't enough kind of people invested in social media on our particular website or our particular page for People Mover. So we had to make sure we sponsored that and paid to get that content to people. Then we also had incentives for participation. So in general, we had 4 different $50 gift cards, just Visa gift cards that we awarded to people randomly selected from email lists that were generated in the MetroQuest survey and also at different events that we held, so that, and we kind of advertised that so that people had a additional boost to come in the door if they're on the fence. And then we had 2 different assembly workshops about the project. The City Assembly, which Michelle gave both presentations, and those went very well. But in general, as you can see, we did quite a bit, and a lot of this was an attempt to get people involved in a conceptual exercise, something that we weren't proposing any specific service changes at the time. We were just asking people what their preferences in terms of trade-offs for transit would be in Anchorage, and that is a little bit difficult at times to get people kind of to do that. Again, but it pays off. So we had over 750 responses to the web survey, which we were very happy with. There were a diverse crowd of about 100+ people. 98 signed in, and a lot more came to the kickoff event that Michelle mentioned. Again, mentioned 38 stakeholders, including businesses. We had a high level of community council interest. So in general, the community councils were supportive and sent out a lot of our materials to their email lists. So that was very helpful. There was definitely media interest. We had the Alaska Dispatch News, which is one of the biggest news outlets in the Anchorage area, in Alaska in general, and they wrote a story on the project, and we were kind of in touch with them throughout, and are still in touch with them. There was support from the administration, so the administration, we worked with them closely, and they were interested in seeing this through and kind of taking it to the next steps with us. We also got buy-in from other municipal departments. For example, our land use planning department is totally redeveloping the land use plan map and rezoning the city eventually, and so this is kind of a nice project that they were able to engage on with us. And then in general, just influencing all of this was a general buzz. So people knew about the project, they had heard about it, they were inclined to engage because they might have heard of it from a friend or an employer or something. So 2 big lessons learned, 2 things that we would do differently the next time around. At the follow-up meetings, so we had 4 follow-up meetings in different communities after the major kickoff event. The turnout was not great. We got some people there, but it was a little disappointing after the big event in May, so after the 100+ turnout. And I think we, looking back, may have invested that time and the time and resources spent on those meetings into perhaps more pop-up meetings and kind of riding the coattails of some other organizations and setting up a table at their events rather than trying to do our own meetings. And then the limited English proficiency group, involving them was definitely a challenge. We didn't hit the numbers we were hoping, but we did try our best to engage, and I think we're going to develop a different strategy for that type of outreach in our next go-around. And then next steps. So a lot has happened since the spring and summer. Actually, just today, we received approval and have released 2 conceptual network maps for a system redesign to the public and stakeholders via our website and an email list. And Jarrett Walker & Associates came up in the late summer 2016 to develop a few conceptual networks, 2 of which we chose to release and are kind of going to work on now. And throughout November, we'll be working with commissions, advisory boards, community partners, holding some public meetings, but again, perhaps focusing on some more kind of pop-up meetings and trying to figure out how to get more turnout at those events. Web outreach, we'll have a project website and are using kind of engagement software, using a online mapping program to get people to interactively look at the maps and that we're proposing and comment on them. And then in December, we're looking at refining two concepts based upon all the feedback we get, and then kind of arriving at a preferred concept, then bringing that preferred concept out to people again throughout December 2016. Having a month of public comment in January, and then hopefully at the end of that month, arriving at a final preferred concept that everybody can live with. And that's it.
Very good. We already have a bunch of questions in the chat box, so let's get at them. And any questions that we don't get to, we will get to in the follow-up material, so have no fear. So the first question that came in was, could these surveys be sent to an existing list as well, or are they designed to be completed in person at an interactive station? The answer is both. If you're speaking about MetroQuest and the examples that I showed, most of the participation is people on the internet accessing it, whether it's advertisement through an email blast that goes out from the municipality or agency, or a promotional campaign, or hearing about it from their friends on Twitter or Facebook, all of the above. To complement that, I would say it's possible and quite strategic, as Colin mentioned, to target some populations at existing community events and so forth to fill in some of the gaps that you might have otherwise. So hopefully that answers that question. Next question: how did you select the community councils to present information?
I'll take that. This is Colin. So first, there are a lot of community councils in Anchorage, and we couldn't give presentations to all, and not all are actually interested in having us present to them. But we started by targeting community councils that currently had transit service of some sort, and sent out invitations individually to each of them. And those that selected or that were willing to have us come speak ended up being about 17.
Very good. The next question is a really specific planning-oriented question that maybe is best answered in the follow-up material. It's it's about specific intersections and that sort of thing. I'm thinking that's maybe not interesting for everybody online, but we will answer that in the follow-up material. I'm going to skip over that one if you don't mind. Has anybody joined us online that wants to ask a question live? All right. People are still shy or thinking. That's good. How did you select your stakeholders? How were they recruited? What efforts were made to include lower income community members that would be most impacted by the changes? Colin, I guess that's for you.
Yep. So we worked closely with the mayor's office to figure out kind of a list of stakeholders, and then some stakeholders led us to other stakeholders. For example, the Anchorage Community Economic Development Corps was able to provide us with a lot of business contacts to try to get their involvement. And then there were community groups representing a lower income and non-English speaking groups, and they were included in the stakeholder list, and also through them we were able to get some additional contacts. So it sort of unfolded organically, and we also tried to tap into the other municipality or departments within the municipality and their existing contacts and people they had included in previous plans.
Very good. Well, the questioner that I skipped over before has submitted a plea for that she thinks it would be interesting. So who am I to question that? Let us read the question and do our best with it. So it's a little bit of a long one, so stay tuned. How would you select the connection point for buses? Because there is no map, it is hard to tell exactly where this spot would be, but it looks like Midtown, northeastern Anchorage, which includes some of the highest crime spots in the city. How would this be dealt with?
what kind of safety features would be put in place to make people feel comfortable? What about protection from the weather? Oh, people are asking questions here, and it's scrolling way up on me. If people need to change buses, will they likely be waiting out in weather longer?
This is Michelle. I'll take Shannon's question.
All
So
right.
First of all, I would like to say, Shannon, you seem to have some enthusiasm for transit network design, and it's really fun, and I encourage you to teach yourself a little bit of it, because one of the trickiest parts of transit network design and the puzzle that we solve as designers is, where should the buses connect? And in some cities, the shape of the city is such that it really makes sense to have a radial network in which all the bus lines go downtown, they all connect downtown. And then in other cities with different shapes, it sometimes makes sense to have a frequent grid where frequent bus lines cross each other at major intersections and people just transfer there. Now, the diagram I showed you, actually, the place names on it were from Anchorage, and that may have been a bit misleading because the shape of the diagram is actually totally fictional. It could have been just as well a grid instead of that star-shaped network with the connection point in the center. So the Anchorage-specific answer to your question is that what we're recommending for Anchorage is more of a frequent transit grid in which people would make connections between more frequent routes at intersections all across the city, just based on what makes the most sense for their trip. They wouldn't necessarily go to one single connection point. However, in Anchorage, there are 2 points that are generally a place where many transit routes come together, and that is around the university and medical centers and also downtown. Very good.
Well, thanks, Michelle, and great answer.
And also, I want to say one more thing about weather. That's a real challenge in Anchorage, not only the weather that might be falling upon you from the sky, but also the weather that comes up at you from the road. Anchorage has very snowy sidewalks that can turn icy and don't necessarily get taken care of, which makes it hard to walk and therefore hard to access transit. So that's a known difficulty in helping people access transit in Anchorage and helping people transfer between buses.
Yeah, and this is Colin. I'd add a little bit to that as well. We'll find out a lot more about people's preferences in the end for that trade-off when we get to our next kind of implementation phase that I mentioned. And also there's the question of do we, yes, people might have to walk through snow and ice, but if we have routes that only come every hour, they're pretty infrequent, then people also have to wait in the cold in a lot of cases, so if they miss a bus. And that's two trade-offs that we're trying to get people's final opinion on, I suppose, in the coming months.
Very good. Okay, so we are short on time. Let's take a couple more questions, and then let's answer the rest of the questions in the follow-up material. A couple of people have been asking about the software, so there's 2 questions. Can you say more about how the apps were created? How much did that cost? Who owns the software? Is there an existing customizable product available? Somebody else on a similar vein said, how easy is it to put together one of the online surveys? Does it require a big learning curve for somebody that hasn't created one before? So I can address that, and maybe Colin, Michelle, you can weigh in if you have any comments as well. MetroQuest is a customizable product, so basically it is comprised of a number of different screen types, and you pick which screens are going to make the most sense for your engagement process and simply fill in the blanks. We have a wizard that you can use to essentially just put your content in there and make it go live. So that's relatively new, and the costs are sort of in the $12,000 range for a single project. We have just launched a all-you-can-engage annual subscription pricing based on the size of the community, so it scales to small communities as well. Which doesn't limit you to any cost per project. In terms of the learning curve, the wizard that we have developed, and I don't know if Colin and Michelle, you were able to use that because it's relatively new. It is designed to be sort of as easy to use as Facebook. You just put in the content and press submit, and it populates itself. But maybe you can talk about what your experience was in terms of your learning curve associated with the online survey. Colin or Michelle?
Yeah, I'll say that the first time I did a MetroQuest survey, even though I had wanted to for years use this scenarios tool in particular, the first time I did it was for this project for Anchorage. But I did it a second time for the city of Richmond in Virginia, and it was so much easier the second time because I knew what to expect and I knew how to prepare. But, MetroQuest staff was really helpful as I went through the process of filling in all the content. I didn't get to use the new Magic widget. Instead, we used the older Excel system, but it was still totally fine. I didn't need to know how to code or, any kind of graphic design. I just needed to get all the content prepared in advance and get it entered in. So I imagine it'll be even better in the future. Right. But there is no question that for me, the first time was more difficulty just because I had to learn some things, and then now I feel like I could do it really quickly and easily in many cities as it comes, as it becomes relevant.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, and we really did design that wizard, set it up yourself capability for people who are lay people that were not technical, because essentially that's most of the people that are using MetroQuest are planners or engagement people and don't really have the kind of technical skills to be fiddling around with code and that sort of thing. So that's really what we were trying to go for. Let's take one more question, and then I apologize. We've got so much interest and so many questions, we can't get to them, but let's take one more question. Colin, I think this is about your second round of engagement. Why are you having the second round of engagement during holiday season? Would that seem to thwart the public involvement, or are you planning on doing that?
Yep, so we're not actually holding any engagement within a week of any holidays, so either Thanksgiving or Christmas. We're kind of front-loading the months so that they're avoiding those times. The reason, preferably we'd have more time in general for the outreach process, but we are kind of cramming a lot into the couple months, and it's kind of due to a pretty aggressive implementation time frame that's out of our control.
Right. Well, that totally makes sense. And I hear what the questioner is saying. It is very difficult to get people's attention during certain times of the year. So, completely makes sense to target your initiatives when people actually have the time. That being said, the typical engagement period is 3 months. So it's not like these things are just like a couple weeks and then they're over. So, it can span, a whole season. And it's important, I think, taking lessons from this case study to keep the drumbeat going of advertisement and promotions and that sort of thing, and make sure that social networks are continuing to happen to make sure that participation continues throughout the engagement period. With that, we've got a lot more questions that we're not going to have a chance to get to, but thank you for your questions. I want to let you know that I'm going to leave the Join Me chat box open for another 15 minutes. So even after we sign off and say goodbye, feel free to add your questions in there or email me if you want. I'm going to send you an email in a few minutes, so you can just reply to that. Any questions that come in, we'll try to get to them as well. But I am going to call an end to this because we have gone a little bit over. I just want to tell you very briefly about the follow-up steps. As I said, the recording is on its way. It will arrive hopefully tomorrow morning in your inbox with the answers to the questions that we received. Also, I will send you in a few minutes the link for those AICP members that have joined us for their credits. And of course, if you have any other questions, there is my contact information. I would be happy to either, if I can answer your question or direct you to the right resource to get you the information you need, I'm happy to do that. And with that, I'm going to say thank you so much to Michelle and Colin for your presentation. I think based on the questions that are coming in, and I've already gotten 4 emails of kudos for the presentation just as I was checking. And so well done, very good, and thanks for the positive feedback, folks, and thank you very much for participating today. So thanks again, Colin and Michelle.
No problem. My pleasure.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.